1953. A military transport plane lands at Travis Air Force Base, California. On board are American prisoners of war, finally coming home from Korea. But something is wrong. 21 of them refused to come back at all. They chose to stay with their communist captors. And the ones who did return? 38% of American POWs died in Korean captivity. Dozens signed confessions, admitting to war crimes they never committed. Some made radio broadcasts denouncing their own country. The US military had a problem. Not that soldiers were being captured. That was expected. The problem was that when captured, they were breaking completely, and no one had trained them not to. What happened next created the most psychologically intense training program in the American military. A program so effective that decades later, 2 psychologists would reverse engineer it, flip it inside out, and sell it back to the CIA as a torture methodology. This is how SERE trains soldiers to resist torture, and why the same techniques designed to protect American lives were weaponized to destroy others. Welcome to the Interrogation Files, where power, psychology, and control are decoded, and you learn what they don't want you to know. Today, I'm going to break down the military's classified resistance training program. First, the psychological science that makes it work. Second, the real POWs who proved these techniques could survive years of torture. And third, the dark reversal that turned defensive training into offensive interrogation. By the end, you will understand exactly how the mind can be conditioned to resist, and what happens when that knowledge falls into the wrong hands. To understand SERE, you need to understand the disaster that created it. During the Korean War, Chinese and North Korean captors did something American military planners had never seen before. They did not just interrogate prisoners, they systematically dismantled their identities. They called it re-education. Americans called it brainwashing. The techniques were surgical. Captors would isolate prisoners, deprive them of sleep, subject them to hours of political lectures, reward collaboration with food and warmth, punish resistance with beatings and stress positions. Over weeks and months, prisoners began signing confessions, making propaganda broadcasts. Some genuinely began believing the ideology forced upon them. In 1952, Colonel Frank Schwabel and 35 other captured Air Force personnel publicly confessed to committing biological warfare against North Korea. It was completely fabricated. But they confessed anyway. When investigators examined what went wrong, they found something disturbing. American servicemen had no framework for resistance, no training, no psychological preparation. When subjected to systematic coercion, they had no tools to fight back. On August 17, 1955, President Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10631, establishing the Code of Conduct, 6 articles governing how American service members must behave in captivity. Article 3 specified that when questioned, a prisoner may only provide name, rank, service number, and date of birth, nothing else. But doctrine without training is just words on paper. The military needed to teach soldiers how to resist the techniques that had broken combat veterans. They needed to let soldiers experience coercion before they faced it for real. They needed SERE. SERE, which stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, operates through 3 levels. Level A provides basic code of conduct instruction for all military personnel. Level B offers intermediate training for those operating near front lines. Level C is the full immersion experience, reserved for those at highest capture risk: combat aircrew, Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance. The Air Force runs its primary SERE school at Fairchild Air Force Base in Washington, training approximately 14,500 students annually. The Navy operates facilities in Maine and at a remote 6,000-acre site in California's Cleveland National Forest. The Army's program runs out of Camp McCall, North Carolina, designed by Lieutenant Colonel Nick Rowe, himself a POW who escaped after 5 years with the Viet Cong. Level C training spans 19 to 21 days across 3 phases. Phase 1 is academics, 10 days of classroom instruction covering the code of conduct, survival medicine, counter-interrogation techniques, and historical lessons from previous POW experiences. Former prisoners of war often address students directly. Trainees learn not just what to expect, but why. The psychological mechanisms behind coercion, the science of resistance. Phase 2 is field training. Students are dropped into wilderness with minimal equipment, often just a knife, canteen, and uniform. Over 5 to 6 days, they learn food procurement, shelter construction, land navigation, and evasion techniques. Phase 3 is where the psychology happens, the resistance training laboratory. Following capture, during the evasion exercise, students are transported to a mock POW camp. Instructors wear Warsaw Pact-style uniforms. They speak in thick Slavic accents. What follows is deliberate psychological pressure, sensory deprivation through hooding, sensory overload via strobe lights and loud recordings, stress positions, confinement in 3 by 3 foot plywood boxes, sleep deprivation, food restriction, mock interrogations using standardized coercion methods. One SERE graduate recalled becoming convinced he was being held in an actual prisoner of war camp, despite knowing it was training. Safety observers monitor continuously, watching for signs that role players may be taking their parts too far. Here is where the science becomes critical. SERE's effectiveness rests on a psychological principle called stress inoculation. Developed by psychologist Donald Meichenbaum, stress inoculation operates like a medical vaccine. You expose individuals to enough stress to activate psychological coping mechanisms without overwhelming them. When stress inoculation succeeds, performance improves during subsequent stressful encounters. The training builds 4 core skills. First, goal setting and segmenting, breaking overwhelming situations into smaller, achievable objectives. You do not survive 5 years of captivity. You survive this hour, then the next one. Second, mental rehearsal, visualizing successful performance under stress before encountering it. POWs who mentally practiced resistance reported better outcomes than those who did not. Third, arousal control, regulating breathing, heart rate, and physiological responses. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Simple techniques that prevent panic from hijacking cognition. Fourth, self-talk, managing internal dialogue to counter despair with rational self-statements. Not, I cannot take this anymore, but they want me to break. I will not give them that. Research by Dr. Charles Morgan at Yale documented SERE's physiological impact. His studies found cortisol levels during SERE interrogation were some of the greatest ever documented in humans, comparable to actual combat stress. Yet this extreme stress serves a purpose. High-performing students released greater levels of neuropeptide Y and DHEA, hormones associated with stress resilience. These individuals showed better accuracy on cognitive tests following stress exposure. SERE specifically counters a phenomenon called learned helplessness. In 1967, psychologist Martin Seligman conducted a famous experiment. Dogs receiving inescapable electric shocks later failed to escape, even when escape became possible. They had learned that outcomes were independent of their responses. They stopped trying. This is exactly what skilled interrogators exploit. If a prisoner believes nothing they do matters. If they believe resistance is futile, they stop resisting. Learned helplessness is the psychological destination of every coercive interrogation. SERE training documents explicitly state that maximum effort will be made to ensure students do not develop learned helplessness during training. The program achieves this by ensuring trainees maintain some degree of control. They can apply resistance techniques. They can communicate covertly with fellow prisoners. They know the ordeal will end. This crucial difference between controlled training and actual captivity would become central to later controversy. The Vietnam War provided SERE's ultimate field test. Among the 766 American POWs held in North Vietnam, organized resistance produced remarkable outcomes. Despite averaging over 5 years in captivity with systematic torture, Vietnam POW mortality rates after repatriation were lower than World War II and Korean War POWs. Vice Admiral James Stockdale emerged as the resistance architect. Shot down on September 9, 1965, Stockdale became the highest-ranking naval officer held in North Vietnam. He spent more than 7 years in captivity, 4 years in solitary confinement, 2 years in leg irons. He was tortured 15 times. Stockdale drew on Stoic philosophy, specifically the teachings of Epictetus. Lameness is an impediment to the leg, but not to the will. He created the BAC US resistance code. Do not bow in public. Stay off the air, meaning no propaganda broadcasts. Admit no crimes. Never kiss them goodbye, meaning no collaboration. Unity over self. When captors attempted to film him for propaganda, Stockdale smashed his own face with a stool to make himself unpresentable. On another occasion, he attempted suicide the night before a scheduled torture session, believing his death would protect intelligence he might reveal. Rear Admiral Jeremiah Denton spent 7 years and 7 months in captivity. On May 2, 1966, during a televised propaganda interview, Denton feigned difficulty with the studio lights. While speaking words of apparent compliance, he blinked a message in Morse code, TORTURE. It was the first clear confirmation to U.S. naval intelligence that American POWs were being systematically tortured. The broadcast went out. The enemy never noticed, but American intelligence analysts did. Senator John McCain spent 5 years and 5 months at Hoa Lo Prison, known as the Hanoi Hilton. When captors discovered his father was Admiral John McCain, Jr., commander of all U.S. forces in the Vietnam theater, they offered early release for propaganda value. McCain refused. Code of Conduct. Article 3 states prisoners will accept neither parole nor special favors from the enemy. This refusal earned him severe torture. Cracked ribs, smashed teeth, new fractures. The North Vietnamese identified their most resistant prisoners and consolidated them in a special facility called Alcatraz. The 11 men held there, including Stockdale and Denton, were labeled the worst troublemakers and leaders of American resistance. They were held in 3 by 9-foot windowless concrete cells, shackled with leg irons every night, lights on constantly. They never broke. Communication proved essential to psychological survival. Captain Carlisle Harris remembered a code from Air Force Survival School, a system using a 5x5 grid. To communicate the letter H, tap twice for row 2, pause, then tap 3 times for column 3. The tap code spread through Hoa Lo like a virus. Guards would separate prisoners caught communicating. This inadvertently spread the code further as each prisoner taught new cellmates. By August 1965, most prisoners had learned it. Colonel Harris explained its psychological function. First and foremost, it was a morale booster. It helped us maintain our sanity. A POW who felt totally alone without any communication had his mental capabilities severely impaired. The code maintained military hierarchy through walls. It allowed prisoners to identify chain of command. It let them resist as a unified force rather than isolated individuals. The program's darkest chapter began after September 11th, 2001. In December 2001, the Defense Department asked the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency, which oversees SERE, about detainee exploitation. 2 SERE psychologists would transform defensive resistance training into offensive interrogation methodology. James Mitchell joined the Air Force in 1975 and became chief of psychology at Fairchild's SERE School. Bruce Jessen preceded him as senior psychologist there. Neither had experience as interrogators. Neither had specialized knowledge of al-Qaeda, counterterrorism, or relevant cultural expertise. The Senate Intelligence Committee stated it bluntly. The psychologist's prior experience was at the SERE school. Neither psychologist had any experience as an interrogator. In May 2002, Martin Seligman, the psychologist who discovered learned helplessness, gave a 3-hour lecture at the Navy SERE School in San Diego. Mitchell and Jessen attended. They proposed applying learned helplessness theory to break down detainee resistance, the precise opposite of SERE's purpose. On August 4, 2002, Mitchell and Jessen began waterboarding Abu Zubaydah, the first detainee subjected to enhanced interrogation. Their company ultimately received $81 million before the contract was terminated. The CIA's own Office of Medical Services acknowledged the fundamental difference. The SERE waterboard experience is so different from subsequent agency usage as to make it almost irrelevant. In SERE training, waterboarding was administered once for less than a minute with the ability to stop. Abu Zubaydah was waterboarded 83 times in 1 month. The Senate Committee's investigation reviewed over 6 million pages of CIA records. Their conclusion was unequivocal. The CIA's use of enhanced interrogation techniques was not an effective means of acquiring intelligence or gaining cooperation from detainees. The historical irony was complete. SERE techniques were originally studied because Chinese interrogators had used them during the Korean War to extract false confessions. Not accurate intelligence. The entire premise was flawed from the beginning. So what does this mean for you? The principles that help soldiers survive captivity apply far beyond military contexts. Stress inoculation works because controlled exposure builds resilience. The same psychology that helps a POW survive torture helps an executive handle a crisis, helps an athlete perform under pressure, helps anyone facing circumstances that threaten to overwhelm them. The core techniques translate directly. Segment the challenge. You do not survive the whole thing. You survive this moment. Maintain agency. Find something, anything you can control. Control it deliberately. Connect with others. Isolation is the enemy of resilience. Communication kept prisoners alive for years. Manage your internal dialogue. The most dangerous interrogator is the one in your own head. And perhaps most importantly, know the techniques being used against you. Whether it is a hostile interrogation or a manipulative negotiation, whether it is a high-pressure sales environment or a toxic relationship, the psychology of coercion follows patterns. Once you see those patterns, they lose much of their power. SERE exists because the military learned a hard truth in Korea. You cannot will yourself to resist something you have never experienced. You cannot think your way through systematic psychological assault. You have to train. You have to prepare. You have to know what is coming. The same applies to any form of psychological pressure. The moment of crisis is too late to learn coping mechanisms. The interrogation room is too late to develop resistance strategies. The preparation happens before. The program continues today. Approximately 14,000 soldiers go through SERE training annually. Some of them will never face capture. Some of them will. And for those who do, the difference between coming home and breaking may come down to a few weeks of training that taught them one essential truth. Resistance is not about being unbreakable. It is about having a framework when everything is trying to break you. You have been briefed. What you do with this knowledge is your call. If this changed how you see pressure, manipulation, and psychological resilience, subscribe. Every interrogation follows a playbook. I will decode them all.